All right, so Kellyanne, give us some idea of what we're about to see as far as the White House brief that is due by noon today.
Well, I was just with the legal team upstairs. They are confident, they are prepared, and they're really anxious to do what was denied the president in the House proceedings. Argue the facts. People are saying that we're only talking about process. That just is not true. They're going to have a full-on defense, which will be a great offense on the facts, on the substance here. The president was denied witnesses in the House proceeding. And if the Democrats really want to go down that road and have witnesses, then we're going to have reciprocity in those witnesses.
You just met with the legal team.
I dare them.
You just met with the legal team.
I dare them. I just saw them upstairs. Yes, near my office. They're next door to me. Sandra, the fact that the Democrats want to go down the road of possible witnesses is what our grandmothers always told us. Be careful what you wish for.
What does that mean, Kellyanne?
Witness number one would have to be Hunter Biden. How else would we know about the corruption in Ukraine? Do you know people have been tripping over themselves for the last 6 months or so, including in the mainstream media, saying there's no evidence Hunter Biden did anything wrong? Then he should willingly come and testify. Why not just put himself up and say, I've got nothing to hide, I did nothing wrong? $83,000 a month from Ukraine's largest natural gas company with no energy experience whatsoever. His father has no energy, but he had no energy experience. That's $1 million a year, pretty much. And so if he did nothing wrong, and we're talking, the President of the United States agreed with the Ukrainian people who overwhelmingly elected Zelensky as their president because he ran on an anti-corruption agenda, then if he has nothing to hide, let's have at it. But this nonsense that there are witnesses on our side who would illuminate the failures of the House to put a respectable, constitutionally solid case together, the fact that they think there would be other witnesses, obviously, and you wouldn't call people like Hunter Biden. By the way, this is the first time a president of the United States will be brought up on articles of impeachment that charge no crime. Forget about a high crime. Okay, where's the low crime? Where's the medium crime?
As you know, Democrats are honing in on John Bolton, former national security advisor to the president, as their key witness. If both sides were able to call witnesses, if that were to happen, there's going to be a big debate over that, likely. What would that mean for the White House to have John Bolton testify?
Very little, although the president may exert executive privilege. The House should have called John Bolton if they were so anxious to hear from them. The House put together a rushed, specious, historically thin case. Again, they bear the burden. The president here is like a defendant in a court of law. They bore the burden to prosecute him, and they failed. We were lectured by law professors. We had a bunch of people opining about what they think our policy toward Ukraine should be, who then had to admit they'd never talked to the president at all, let alone about Ukraine. I think 1 or 2 people had ever met the president of the United States in their witness list. So they failed to make a case, and now they want the Senate to play cleanup. You know, for months, the Democrats had this show trial, a one-sided show trial in basically a kangaroo court, not allowing us to present our own witnesses, to present our own evidence, and now they want the Republican-controlled Senate.
So is it fair to say that the White House legal team and the president almost look forward to calling witnesses?
No. What they look forward to is arguing the facts. And they look forward to taking these 2 articles of impeachment, which are abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, and saying that this is the first time in American history that a president hasn't even been charged with a crime in the articles of impeachment.
I mean, I heard you mention executive privilege. Lindsey Graham said over the weekend that that is beyond serious consideration. I heard you say that when we talked about John Bolton being called as a witness. Is that the plan?
I'll let the lawyers file their brief today, and if we ever come to that, there is no guarantee witnesses will be called. I'm merely making the point that these House impeachment managers who are already now in the Senate, they had their chance. They failed to do that. I think Americans are very smart when it comes to how our American jurisprudence works. Sandra, you want to bring a claim against somebody in a civil or criminal trial, you provide the evidence, you provide the witnesses, you bear the burden. And they failed to do that in the House, so they want to rush over to the Senate and have the Senate fill in all the blanks that they failed to do. Where's the bribery claim, extortion, the obstruction of justice, the quid pro quo? All these things we were promised were going to be in there are simply not in the articles of impeachment. We have to stick to the record that came over to the Senate, in my view, that was put together by the prosecution here, the House. And this would be unprecedented. They blocked our witnesses, and now they want witnesses in the Senate. And when people are comparing this to Clinton, let's have a quick review, because I was involved that I'm old enough to remember the Clinton impeachment. He lied to the grand jury on August 17th, 1998, and then he was impeached. He asked his personal secretary to lie about the fact that he had never been alone with Monica Lewinsky. Clearly they were, that he hadn't given her gifts. He's asking his staff to lie. He's lying to his staff, to his cabinet, to members of Congress, and then lying to the grand jury several times, including in front of the whole world in videotape testimony on August 17th, 1998. There's no comparison here on the substance, on the facts.
Well, let me ask you, though, going back to what seems to be is going to boil up as the big debate over witnesses and that 51-vote threshold, 47 Democrats obviously would be a yes. The question is the 4 GOP. Will there be 4 GOP to join? Is the president and his team hearing anything about that this morning when talking to lawmakers?
We respect that the Senate has a job to do here, and constitutionally, they will do that job. It's going to be a very arduous process. No phones, no technology. They will sit and have to listen. They can't ask questions themselves. It would go through the Chief Justice. Everybody, I think, at this point should know that process. But at the same time, the entire question of witnesses, look at what happened in the House. The Republicans, the president was denied calling his own witnesses. That is a complete disgrace. In the Senate, we'll see what happens. You need a 51 vote to actually allow for witnesses. I also, you know, what is this 47 Democrats absolutely positively are going to vote for witnesses? How do we know that's true? I've read that reported, but again, do they want Hunter Biden to be called as a witness?
Republican colleagues of the president, Ted Cruz and others, suggesting that that's the case.
Yeah. Well,
over the
could be. They could be going in lockstep, but look at what happened. The only thing bipartisan so far about this impeachment sham has been that the bipartisan opposition to it in the House. Remember, every single Republican voted against the articles of impeachment, and 2 Democrats did. 3 voted against one of the articles. One of the guys actually switched parties, Democrat to Republican. He was so offended by this impeachment process and the lack of substance in those articles. This is not an abuse of power. This is an abuse of the Constitution.
And I know that that's the case that the White House laid out.
That's right.
And
absolutely.
that's the case the White House laid out in response to the Democrats' brief that came out of the House. So let me ask you about the president heading off to Davos, Switzerland. I believe he's leaving later today in the middle of all of this, which is obviously really something. What is he saying this morning? Have you spoken with him?
Well, the president is actually tweeting, so you know what he thinks about different things today. But look at what he's doing in the midst of all this nonsense. It's exactly the way this man, who I've been working with 4 straight years now, operates. He does the job of the American people. So last week, not 1 but 2 historic trade deals, USMCA and China. That's going to directly benefit the American worker. 76,000 new auto worker jobs are predicted. Read the Reuters report that 0 of the 15 major auto manufacturers are expected to move their production overseas and take the tariff instead. They'll stay here. 176,000 jobs altogether through the USMCA. The China deal is historic. The 29,000 plus Dow Jones average from last week, that benefits the farmers, the ranchers, the manufacturers. So he had 2 big trade deals, the stock markets, the wage growth among the bottom half. And he'll go to Davos, and the president will talk about the economic miracle that is the American economy now, the deregulation, the wage growth, the energy, the LNG, the liquid natural gas development. And also, we now are net exporters of natural gas and oil for the first time. We are exporting it, not dependent on these foreign sources as much. So he has a great anti-socialist, pro-American economy message to deliver in Davos. Whatever nonsense they're doing on Capitol Hill, they'll do. And his team will keep him abreast of that. But his legal team is ready. They're prepared. They're confident. And they've been fairly quiet. While everybody else has been out there preening about what will happen, what won't happen, they've been working in quiet. And we will hear from them tomorrow.
All right, 3 final thoughts. One, I just got note from Capitol Hill that the impeachment managers are heading to the Senate chamber for the walkthrough before the trial. So that is happening now. Final 2 thoughts. State of the Union. Is the president considering delaying that all while the impeachment trial goes on?
We have February 4th circled on our calendar for the State of the Union, day after the Iowa caucus. We look forward to the president delivering that the State of the Union is strong, national security, economic security, working on the guests who will be in the First Lady's box, working on the substance of the address, many people involved. The president is anxious to address the people unfiltered, directly from the president to you, in your living room, on your phone, on your laptop computer, on the radio, however it is you receive the message from the president without everybody telling you what he said and what he meant.
Finally, having just met with with the president's legal team. We're awaiting this brief. When should we expect to see that? Before noon?
It's supposed to be filed around noon. But again, they are prepared. They're ready. I mean, that's a very confident team up there because at last they've had to sit down and take it.
Is the president confident in his legal team?
Yes, he is absolutely confident in his legal team, and he built this team himself. Obviously, Pat Cipollone, our White House counsel, Jay Sekulow, his longest-serving personal attorney, and the others that you have been covering for the last several days, and their associates working round the clock through this past weekend, and even before that. You know, Sandra, it just is not American jurisprudence for the person who's being accused here of things he didn't do to just have to sit down and take it. That shouldn't happen to any of us, let alone the president in the United States. People have weaponized the Constitution here. And folks will remember that. These people wrapping themselves up in, oh, the Constitution, we're worried about the Constitution. They can't even respect the Second Amendment. So I don't need to be lectured by them.
I've got to go, Kellyanne. Does the president believe he will be acquitted after this process is over?
Yes, we know the president will not be removed from office and he will be reelected for many reasons. The historic economy, the deregulation, what he's trying to do, keeping us safe, taking out two major terrorists, al-Baghdadi and Soleimani, two major trade deals, two Supreme Court justices equals 2 terms. And frankly, the people who have pushed this at the exclusion of more work on behalf of the American people probably will have helped him get reelected.
All right, Kellyanne Conway joining us live from the White House this morning. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
Good day.